hard to believe it, but it's that time of year again. And I wonder with what perspective we come to this COVID Christmas time. Has anything changed? Do we feel festive at all? Do we now hold a little more lightly to the things of this world? Do we think more carefully about what we have and how we use it? Did we see the inadequacies of our love and compassion? Did we find hope? Or are we finding it desperately difficult to pick ourselves up to even search for hope? This is our final teaching video in our COVIDSATIONS series, in which the aim has been to equip Christians to give a reason for the hope that we have. We close by looking at grace, God's gift of unmerited favor towards us. Peter's first letter has been our key text, and he not only reminds us in chapter 5 verse 10 that this is all about the God of grace whom we live for, but that his whole letter is summarized by grace. Chapter 5 verse 12, I have written to you briefly, exhorting and declaring that this is the true grace of God. Stand firm in it. Like the psalmist in Psalm 30, Peter affirms that God's anger is but for a moment, and his favor is for a lifetime. Set your eyes on past, present, and future grace, especially amidst those refining trials. Welcome to COVIDSATIONS. G is for nothing but grace, the fullness of God's character towards us, undeserving sinners. Taken this non-piano some time to learn that, but even that attempt is recognizable, isn't it? Of course, Amazing Grace, that great John Newton hymn. We lose that, don't we? We lose that sense of the awe and the majesty and the meaning of grace. You only have to observe the difference in yourself and how you viewed gifts as a child and now as an adult. As a child, wide-eyed excitement, no matter the size of the gift, you just couldn't wait to tear the wrapping paper off as you received that. As an adult, well, you shouldn't have, but I didn't get you something. Or here, I got you something better to prove my worth. Perhaps we've got so conditioned to our performance, something's not for nothing kind of world, that we've not just lost sight of the simplicity and the grace of giving, but more importantly, we've lost sight of the giving of grace. Listen to how gracious God has been to us and how he epitomizes it. 1 Peter chapter 2 verse 9. But you are a chosen race, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a people for his own possession, that you may proclaim the excellencies of him who called you out of darkness into his marvelous light. Once you were not a people, but now you are God's people. Once you had not received mercy, but now you have received mercy. Those verses remind us, he chose you, he anointed you, he set you apart, he claimed you as his own possession, he called you out of darkness into his light. You have been saved by his grace alone, not by any works on your part. In his book, Branded by Grace, Chippy Brand, a South African entrepreneur who started and owned the Grace chain of hotels, amongst other things, he recalls a conversation with a Christian preacher that set him onto the path to true grace in Jesus. It went like this. He asked me who I was and what I did. I'm an engineer, I replied. Are you a Christian? Gulping, I paused before responding. Yeah, well, I try to be. That's impossible, said Dick Lucas with a penetrating, piercing gaze. I shuffled about self-consciously. I felt he could see right through me. And uneasy at the inward notion that I'd been exposed, I began to argue with myself. What does he know about me? I thought, I try my hardest, I'm not that bad compared to other people. He should meet some of the people I work with. I don't beat my wife, and I raced on with my soliloquy, fretfully rattling off a number of other vices I didn't have. I didn't kick the dog. I gave generously to the SPCA, and after all, I was the son of the greatest philanthropist in Benoni. How could a respectable, moral person like me not be a Christian? And that brief conversation haunted him, and mercifully God opened Chippy's eyes to the truth that it is nothing he did that saved him, but through what Christ alone has done on the cross, that he was justified and accepted by God. Like Chippy Brand, I'm sure many who have finally understood grace could sum up their conversation in these words: I stopped trying, and then I found Christ. I became a part of his people, not by being born into it, or having the right pedigree, or upbringing, or performing the right rituals. That was me too when I was younger. And that sort of self-righteousness I realized I needed to repent of as well. I cannot save myself. In fact, I was in perilous standing with him under his right judgment without mercy. But then he reached out. And friends, grace is not just something we receive from God to get us started. No, the God of grace is present throughout us. As Peter puts it in the beginning of his letter, he is multiplying grace to us. We live and breathe in grace, and so grace saves us, but it also changes us. For example, God's grace enables us to truly love, chapter 1, verse 22, having purified your souls by your obedience to the truth for a sincere brotherly love. Love one another earnestly from a pure heart. Don't you find that the more you grow as a believer, the more you realize how little you truly love? And that can be crushing. But the wonderful thing about grace in the gospel is that it doesn't condemn our hearts, but lifts them to love still more deeply and sacrificially, to love God's people and to love those not his people. His grace changes us so that with the compassion and love of Jesus, we, as Simon Gill puts it, feel the hopelessness of those who are far from God. And so God's grace makes us more gracious in our interactions with unbelievers. So as we approach our conversations, we will be praying for ourselves as much as them, that we would connect with their world in some way, willing to give of our time, our hearts, listening intently to theirs, to their hopes, their concerns, their objections, their beliefs, their philosophies, however worlds apart they may be to ours. Where possible, we'll share their interests, share their joys, and especially their heartbreaks, and be always ready to share the hope that we have of a God full of grace, who loves them deeply and wants them as his own. One more thing, I think, that will mean is perhaps the hardest to hear. We will embrace the grace of suffering from God's hand too. Yes, I said grace, the gift of suffering. The world desperately needs Christians who suffer well. Christians who suffer knowing the truth of chapter 4, verse 12 in 1 Peter, that do not be surprised when the fiery trial comes upon you to test you, but rejoice insofar as you share Christ's sufferings, that you may also rejoice and be glad when his glory is revealed. And they suffer knowing the truth of chapter 5, verse 10. After you have suffered a little while, the God of all grace will himself restore, confirm, strengthen, and establish you. Christians, you see, know that suffering comes to test, train, and purify our faith, and it is from a good God, both for our good and his glory. We may not always understand, but what we do in the midst of our suffering will send a clear message to the world of where our hope lies. And as another apostle so tellingly said and experienced, that his grace is indeed sufficient. G is for God's gift of grace. Embrace it each day.